Well, as you can tell, I've returned to the purple and gold for this episode because it's one that LSU has helped shape over the course of the past 100 years. It's also one that is both sweet and troublesome at times. Can you figure out what it is? Well, I don't have much growing in my yard, but it's enough to kind of keep the tradition going. So stay tuned and find out. Welcome back to another episode of Growing Some Louisiana History with me, David Hubbell. And this week's episode is going to focus on something that I've been growing for about 12 years now. Not in large quantities, but something that is part of my family's history, and it is sugarcane. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why I grow sugarcane. If you've ever been down to South Louisiana, you've seen many of the sugarcane fields. Tall stalks of cane growing in long rows along the roadside, and some of the, at least in southeast Louisiana, especially down around the river parish areas where my family came from, of St. James, St. John, and St. Charles parishes, you'll see the cane fields, especially along the river road, but also a little further north all the way up to Baton Rouge. So they're very prevalent, and that's sugarcane country. It's been in that area going back at least 200, 300 years. If you think about Louisiana history, you can figure that maybe sugarcane cultivation occurred probably first in New Orleans and then moved outward afterwards, and you'd be correct. In fact, there's mentions back as far as 1725 of sugar canes, and Bienville talked about it in 1733 being something that was used for making a certain kind of rum drink called tifia. That's really the only purpose, I guess. Basically, they would squeeze the juices and get the alcohol to form, and use that as a form of spirits, if you will. And there really wasn't much done with sugarcane at that point in Louisiana. The main crop there would have really been indigo. In 1751, the Jesuits brought a form of sugarcane called Malabar to New Orleans, and they planted in a patch of land where the Immaculate Conception Church is located on Baronne Street now. And that was really where they first, I think, you started really seeing some early cultivation of it. But even then, it still didn't dominate as a crop. It wasn't until about 1791 when a guy named Antonio Mendez came up with actually getting sugar crystals to form from the cane sugar. Now, the actual granulated sugars go way back, I believe, even to India. But as far as being successful with the crops in Louisiana, it wasn't until he was able to do that. So following this, plantation owner named Etienne de Boré invested his savings into sugarcane cultivation for granulating sugar on a commercial scale. And this was 1794 through 1795. When he ended up proving to be quite successful. His plantation is located, or was located, where the present-day Audubon Park is. And he actually did well enough that in the future he ended up actually becoming the first elected mayor of New Orleans. Now, this Malabar sugarcane was what a lot of the old timers, or in the old newspapers, they talked about being the first phase of sugarcane growing in Louisiana. Now, the Malabar variety dominated, like I said, for about 100 years until about 1822 to 1825, when a fellow named James Quarron brought in a new type of cane, purple cane. And that came on, and that supplanted the Malabar as the preferred cane to be growing. So he did this in, like I said, early 1800s. And it should also be noted that he was one of the first ones to actually use steam engines in his sugarcane refining facility. And this purple cane, it can be mentioned in some of the diaries of like Valcoram and his Le Petit Versailles plantation, which made him all his riches up in Vacherie. That was the kind of cane he was growing, was the purple cane. And so it dominated, but it was without any of these ventures. Anybody who's done any growing of vegetables knows that there's a lot of factors involved. You got to have the right temperatures, waters, and you got to be able to handle any type of setbacks due to droughts or diseases or infestations of insects. And it's around this time that this was, I guess, maybe the golden age of sugar production in South Louisiana, at least from the old days. This is when really the riches started coming in. And so what you start seeing, though, is that there were some imperfections or problems. One of them being the sugarcane borer. If you're familiar with the squash vine borer, it's very similar. Moth will land on the sugarcane and lay an egg, and the larva will, within a few days, work its way down to the cane base and bore into it. And of course, as you can imagine, this would cause problems with the life of the sugarcane, as well as maybe not having as much sucrose in it and sweetness. So that would kind of basically end up with a inferior quality yield for that season. Now, another problem that comes about is something called the mosaic, and it's a virus, and it kind of leaves the cane with the mottled leaves, kind of stunt the growth as well. So here you get a pest infestation, and then you also have a virus issue. And fine borer was first noted about 1855 in St. John the Baptist Parish. And the mosaic was actually first noted around 1916 in Puerto Rico, and it quickly spread across the U.S. Now, the third thing that has been a problem over the years was something called red rot. Now, the red rot is something that affects the roots of the sugarcane, and it's not just that it'll affect it, which obviously can kill the plant, but the other thing I should note is that with sugarcane, it being a grass, when it comes time to harvest it, you can cut it down, but as long as you leave that little stubble, that little short piece in there, it will actually root again from there. And what I understand is that they typically get 3 seasons from a planting, because over time the regrowth did not have quite the same amount of sugar as maybe the initial plant would. But the problem with the red rot is that it would not just affect that season's, but it would affect into the root system and kill it, so that you end up having problems with the second and third growths. So the purple cane was growing along, and I think over the times, it probably would experience one of these 3 different issues, as well as some others that are listed in like the Sugarcane Grower's Handbook. But in around 1920, it's like all of these converged upon the sugar industry in South Louisiana. You had the sugarcane borer, you had the mosaic, and the red rot hitting all around the same time. So much so that sugar production in 1926 was at an all-time low in Louisiana. The third phase we were talking about, that cane, those POJs, those ended up being kind of a mixture of wild cane and the tame canes. So even though they had some benefits, they still had their share of issues. So the fourth phase from India, the Comator breeding stations were designated as CO, and you had CO 281 and CO 290. So the CO 290 is the one I got from my friend Sam Becnel in Vacherie, who knew of me growing them for a number of decades there. Unfortunately, I don't believe that gentleman still has them, and he may not even be around now, but I still have 1 or 2 stalks left, so I've got to do a better job of trying to preserve this. Varieties were noted in 1933 as having an exceptionally high yield, but they weren't without their own issues. They matured late, but then they also were susceptible to the mosaic. But because of the vigorous growth, they actually were probably able to still produce a lot despite having some setbacks or detractions due to that mosaic issue. Since that time, this article I was reading was 1937, so that stopped at that 4th phase of sugarcane. But what you actually saw going forward over the last 90 years thereabouts is that you've actually had at least another 2 phases maybe, or the modern phase. It basically lists from around 1940 to 1990, where you were going to these sugar canes that were bred down in South Florida. They were called CP for Canal Point in Florida, where they were developed. So those pretty much dominated up until like about mid-1980s. And then what they had was one of these varieties, one of them evaluated by the LSU Ag Center or the LSU Breeding Extension Offices, and it was designated as a permanent variety. And so now you end up with what is called LCP 85-384. So basically, since the 1990s through today, what you're seeing is the varieties of sugarcane grown are a mixture or breeds of the CP and the LCP varieties, and those of course are used to, you maximize them for yield, growth, and of course disease and pest resistance. So I think they've learned a lot, especially over the last 80 to 100 years, on how to keep this as a sustainable system and a sustainable plant. Obviously, the growing the same variety over and over again can be a problem, and of course, even with crop rotations and such, you can still have problems. And we see that today even with like citrus. And some of the problems that you would see with these in the past were due to the fact we were bringing in certain canes from different places. As you can tell, even though we had breeding stations that they brought them into to overcome them, a lot of times you ended up with still issues because you'd have a disease in one location and you just end up bringing it to the crops here. So in case you're wondering, about 1 ton of sugarcane, depending on whatever variety it is, can produce about, I think it's like 180 to 220 pounds of refined sugar. And so that roughly works out to be about 10% of a cane can actually become refined or granulated sugar. And I guess maybe refined doesn't necessarily have to be granulated. Maybe it can be molasses or even the unbleached sugar. So as you can imagine, 1/10 cane to get a part of the product, get a usable product, means really kind of low yields. So you got to imagine you have to have massive fields of sugar cane to just get enough sugar. And you think about how much we are addicted, if you will, or rely upon sugar these days. So that's a lot of sugar cane. Now, refined sugar industry itself, from what I read, is about 55% of the sugar comes from sugar beets and 45% comes from sugar cane. And I think maybe of that whole sugar cane industry, maybe 45% now comes from South Louisiana. So why am I growing sugar cane? Well, it's certainly not to granulate my own sugar. Part of the reason is obviously because of my family background. We were supported by sugar for a number of years, but of course what ends up happening is that brought some sustainability as far as how we were able to make a living. Well, one of the traditions along the river parishes is andouille making. And andouille sausage is the chunks of spicy pork, butt and shoulders, what I kind of use today, that were smoked meats. And so they are very low in fat. During boucheries, you would get these meats, and this is a way of preserving your meats before refrigeration. So you would cut them into the big chunks, and maybe you might have 10-15% fat, but the rest of it is going to be meat. And you're going to season it with just basic seasonings: salt, black pepper, cayenne, and granulated garlic, or fresh garlic. The main thing was that you would stuff this into beef middles. So you ended up with like an 1.5 to 2-inch sausage, and you would smoke these. And the traditional method that I learned that they used to smoke these, which gives the river parish andouille such a wonderful flavor, is one was over pecan wood, some was over corn cobs, but the other component was sugar cane. And so when I read about that, I decided, you know what, I'd like to grow some sugar cane, mostly because of the fact that it's kind of a beautiful plant. It's prettier to me than, say, bamboo. It's a beautiful plant, but it's also functional in the sense that even if I get a couple of canes a year, I can use those to smoke andouilles or turkeys or other kind of meats. So and plus these particular canes, the older canes, actually were good for chewing. You can still chew the ones today, but I'm not sure if they have as much of the same, the fibrousness. I don't know how easy they are to chew compared to the older ones. And that was a treat that a lot of people would do in the old days. They'd cut the canes, and that's even what they did way back in the 1700s. Before you were refining it, people would just cut that and kind of have that as a snack, as a treat. And you chew it, and then it kind of gets very fibrous, and then just spit it out, but you extract the sugars from it. So that's still a fun tradition to do. My girls have done it once or twice, but my yields have not been real great the last several years, so I need to get back to where I'm taking what I've got left and really get it in a good spot where I'm able to produce several canes. And I'll show you when I get out in the field, out to the plant, I should say, because I got the one plant. I'll show you about the different segments and how I learned that you should plant it. But the sugar industry itself, the other thing was that the refining method was not something very easy. You'd have the grinding season, which would start typically from September and go maybe all the way through January. And I believe it's called rouleçon. I probably butchered that totally, but that was a grinding season. And you know, people would not families wouldn't be, or not families, but the fathers or the sugarcane workers weren't able to actually celebrate Christmas on Christmas Day because of the fact that they were still grinding. Sometimes grinding season ended early, but it was a non-stop issue. And that's the same thing today. You'll see cane trucks along the roads, very slow moving. You got a lot of migrant workers now working the cane fields to harvest the cane, but typically you'd actually start planting in August. And so that's what I need to do now, is dig a trench, plant my cane, and it'll start growing for the next season. Then when the season comes, you protect it over the winter from usually cold and frost, which you never had. You had some bad years, but usually the mild winters of South Louisiana weren't too much of an issue. But you would do that, and then the spring it would just start growing. Like I said, it's a grass, and as it just grows and grows, and you obviously have to watch for insects and viruses, as well as need to weed around it, just like you do any other plant. But then coming around September, you would start cutting it down and bringing it to the mill to be ground. And in the old days, you used to have like a 3-roller system, and it would roll around, hook a horse or a mule to it, and you'd stick the cane in, and it would grind it and extract the juice. So these juices would be heated in a series of open top kettles, and they'd be heated, clarified, and evaporated. And you go from the big kettles, when you have low viscosity, almost water-like density, to where it gets thicker, and you go to a middle kettle, and then you go to a smaller kettle. And these were in a series of like a brick oven that had them all side by side, and they're constantly moving and stirring, and that helps with the evaporation. And then of course it was very manually intensive. You're around the great amount of heat, you're trying to move it and spoon it into the next kettle. And these kettles can still be found today actually in many yards around South Louisiana. People employ them for now, kind of like goldfish ponds. They're really beautiful, and some of them go back as far as, like I said, the early 1800s. So if you're able to get your hands on one of those, you're very fortunate. You can also get some replicas made, which I hope to get one day, get one of those for my yard, and have that as kind of a testament of the old process. But like I said, that process was very dangerous, and the enslaved that had to do the work on that. Oftentimes they could get burned easily. As you imagine, a big open top vessel that's boiling liquid, and they're having to get close to it and constantly stir it. And then as you transfer the solution from one pot or one kettle to the next, you also have some losses, because it wasn't, just imagine if you're spooning something in from one pot to another, you're going to have some drippage and losses. So once all that was done and it got thick enough, they could then determine that it looked like the crystals were going to form, maybe more of rule of thumbs or just experience. And they would go into a shallow wooden tank, and where it would cool and further granulate. And then those would go into barrels known as hogsheads. And at the bottom of these barrels, they actually had several holes, and these holes would let the molasses come out of the process. And so you would collect all that molasses to be barreled to be sent elsewhere. And that's really the sugar process for much of the 1800s, until we started making improvements. One great improvement was a multi-stage evaporator system developed by a fellow named Norbert Rilou in the mid-1800s, which allowed the evaporation process to be done much more safely. You'd have basically the trays set on top of each other, you'd have a vacuum, and you were able to heat the solution up with a lower temperature, and the steam would float upwards, and as it would heat up the subsequent trays. Thus you would reduce losses due to yield from transferring from place to place, and it was safer, and you ended up with a better quality product because you ended up not burning your sugar as much. Of course, in the modern age, we're able to now do all this with mechanization, and you still have to harvest the cane in the field, but that was a very dangerous job as well for the enslaved, because the leaves of the sugar cane are very sharp. If you can imagine, you're in 3-foot rows. The canes are probably about 3 to 4 inches apart, so you're very densely packed. In the hot heat of the summer, you're going through there, and of course they're cutting the canes, and they're using these cane knives, which I'll try to show you an example of as well that I have. And so they're doing all this, it's like razor blades on their skin, the heat of the day, and they're having to cut these down. And even though it's the fall, it's still hot out there in South Louisiana. So nowadays, especially after World War II, you had actual mechanical equipment starting to do all that harvesting. So now you're able to harvest it and bring it by truck to the factory. The trucks themselves are actually physically lifted and dumped, and then you go through a mechanical rolling process, and they separated the juices from the cane, and the remaining juice, or the remaining cane, I think it's called bagasse, and that is used actually to fuel the furnaces in there that provide the heat. And then you go through a series of refining processes, and the modern process is very interesting. Like I said, you have the multi-stage evaporative system, but now they got a bunch of centrifuges and vats and all kind of different things, and you end up with a light brown kind of unrefined product before it goes into actually the bleaching process. If you get a chance to tour a sugar refinery, I highly recommend it. I had that opportunity in 2013 to go, or 2011, to go to the Cora, Texas refinery in White Castle, Louisiana. And in fact, I'm going to include a link in the description below because they have a virtual tour that you can take there. So it's an interesting process nonetheless. But what we're going to do now is we're going to check out my one remaining cane and see what it looks like, and I'll try to give you a little more description there. So this is what remains of my CO290 sugarcane. As you can see, I've got it in this pot. Primarily I had it in the back, and it grew well for a number of years, but then shade issues caused a problem. But what you'll see down here is that, pardon the weeds, you'll see what you got is a primary stalk and then a secondary coming off of there. And like I said, I can cut this back, and the secondary will take over next year out of this pot. And when you cut it, you have these different nodes, and those nodes are where the roots will come from. And you can even see that's a root bud right there. They call that little thing, I think that's striped, the bud furrow. Some of the other stuff they call like corky patch. And then in between those nodes is known as the internode. And then if you look up closely here, right around this one in particular, let's see there, yeah, you can see things like the growth ring, root bands, and then leafy scars is what they talk about it. So it's a very interesting plant to grow. But what you would do is you'd cut it off, and at each of these nodes is where the roots will come out. So if you can imagine that they tell me in August, you cut them out, cut them back, and then you plant them, you know, the length. So this one, being a shorter one, has really got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 nodes. And those nodes are about, well, maybe 3.5 inches apart. So you put them in a row, and you'd have these plants coming up about 3.5 inches apart. And of course, they grow up with these leaves, really pretty leaves, but like I said, they're very sharp on the ends. So you can only imagine if they were even bigger, how much sharper they'd be. Now my neighbor, actually, his brother, he grew up in Florida, and his brother got him some old heirloom cane. I have no idea which kind this is, but this will even give you another description, and you can really see how, you can even hear it, how sharp those blades are. I will plant this one too. I'll just try to segregate it some from my CO290, primarily, like I said, because of the fact that I'm just trying to grow it as a crop for an heirloom standpoint, as well as from smoking of the andouille sausage, as well as some other things. But like I said, you can grow them in the pot, as you can see, like he has here, and or you could grow them in the field. And I'll try to include some pictures of the stalks when I got them from Mr. Becnel, as well as when I had a few growing in my garden. But this would be the time of year to start looking for them. Cane season, maybe pick you a piece up off the road that falls off the truck, or if you're in South Louisiana, you know, ask some of your buddies if they have a source. Also, you can oftentimes find them at farmers markets. People will sell them. And so I know in Alabama, a lot of times what the guys would tell me is they dig trenches and they just bundle them together in, I guess, late, I don't know, the fall, and they would just kind of bury them, not with the intention of growing them, but to protect them. And then when the spring came, they would dig them up, and then they would replant them in a similar manner, just about 2 or 3 inches deep into a furrow, cover it up, and just let it start growing. And it's like I said, it's a very simple technique. All you got to do is get the source. So hopefully I'll do a better job of maintaining my CO290. Obviously, it's like I said, it's about a 90-year-old variety from India introduced to South Louisiana. So I'll try to keep that up in memory of the gentleman in South Louisiana who saved it, and I'll try to keep it going, and hopefully maybe next year I'll have 6 more stalks. We'll see. Well, that's it, folks. Hope you found this interesting and sweet, although troublesome history with sugar. Is not just the history with the enslaved, but the other problem is, of course, what it does to you from a health standpoint. Too much sugar can be detrimental to your health. It's not a complex carbohydrate in a lot of cases, so we go for the sweetness. We love the sweetness, but it doesn't always do well with our bodies. And if your body has a problem processing sugars, you end up with different forms of health issues like diabetes and such. And that's been a big problem in South Louisiana, especially over the last 100 years. And my family has a history of diabetes. So that's something you always have to work on, watch and work. So much like the Pepere tobacco, sugar has its place in moderation for those who choose to indulge in it. The main thing is to be able to make that choice and have that opportunity to know whether or not you want to include granulated sugars in your life. But otherwise, as a plant, it's very beautiful. It's fascinating to grow. Like I said, it's got dark and troublesome history, but as well as also a fascinating history. So hopefully you found this information interesting, and hopefully you can get a couple of canes to grow in your own yard. Like I said, they're beautiful. They'd be beautiful as an ornamental and semi-functional if you want to use them for smoking meats, or even just to chew on from time to time. If this information has been helpful to you, please give it a like and a share on your favorite social media sites. Also, if you haven't done so, I'd really appreciate if you would subscribe to the David J. Hubbell YouTube channel, and leave your thoughts and comments below. If you grow sugarcane, I know I've got some friends that are actually in the sugarcane business, so I hope they don't critique it too hardly and trying to get this into like a 15-minute segment. So there's a lot of history and a lot of information on the industry that I failed to cover, because just in the short duration, I'm trying to look at it more from the planting standpoint and growing, at least from a backyard standpoint. But anyway, hopefully if you've done this as a backyard crop or backyard plant, please leave a comment below. If you have any questions, send them to me at rpcajun2r@gmail.com. And if I can find some links on where to buy the seed cane, I will include that in the description as well. Once again, thank you for joining me, and I will see you next week.